My presentation is titled The Height of Identification, Metaphorizing Corporeality and Illness. I begin my presentation with 3 statements which would act as entry points into this study. The first statement is from Alfred Korzybski from Manhood of Humanity. He says, "There is nothing mystical about the fact that ideas and words are energies which powerfully affect the physiochemical base of our time-binding activities." Next statement is from Lakoff and Johnson from the text Metaphors We Live by, I quote, "Metaphor is pervasive in everyday life, not just in language but in thought and action. Our ordinary conceptual system, in terms of which we both think and act, is fundamentally metaphorical in nature." And the last statement is from Susan Sontag from the text Illness as Metaphor. She says, "My point is that illness is not a metaphor, and that the most truthful way of regarding illness and the healthiest way of being ill is the one most purified of, most resistant to metaphoric thinking. Yet it is hardly possible to take up one's residence in the kingdom of the ill, unprejudiced by the lurid metaphors with which it has been landscaped." I begin my presentation. Our thought ideational processes can seldom escape the metaphorical impulse, which is a persistent habit of human psyche. Metaphors are not the inhabitants of an esoteric domain, far removed from the realm of everyday language and thought. As metaphorization is integral to complex processes of contemplating, imagining, and languaging, we cannot look at metaphorical thinking as limited to figurative expressions or embellishing of meaning in a narrow linguistic or rhetorical sense. Metaphors operate at the levels of word, sentence, and discourse, straddling the domains of rhetoric, semantics, and hermeneutics. The paper illustrates how metaphorical thinking about illness and body influence perceptions on personal experience and social phenomena. I use the term metaphorical thinking rather loosely so that discussion of other figurative ideational devices employed in talking about corporeal experience is also incorporated. A metaphorical expression does not always necessarily imply obvious similitude. In a metaphorical statement like "the common cold is a swivel door," any self-evident similarity between the ailment and the particular kind of door is absent. In the construction and interpretation of metaphors, emotional and imaginative rationality come into play. Lakoff and Johnson opine that the only kind of similarity relevant to metaphors is experiential, not objective. Using metaphors to think or talk about illness and body is common. Consider this expression: "The inoperable tumor was an accursed bundle of pain which she had to bear to the threshold of death." This metaphor makes us picture illness as a doomed journey with a lot of pain that leaves one's shoulder only on dying. Insinuations about sin and redemption are woven into the texture of this metaphor. A statement like xenophobia and jingoism have infected our already ailing foreign policy pathologizes the foreign policy metaphorically. Metaphorical thinking may take one to the height of the isness of identification that Korzybski warned us about. By this, I mean that we may tend to equate the metaphorical statement or its interpretation to the actual phenomenon the metaphorical expression refers to, without being aware that their respective contexts and truth conditions differ substantially. To give an example, when an illness is metaphorically called a silent killer or a serial killer, the associative meanings human minds construct would personify the illness as a perverse, scheming, and dangerous persona waiting for a chance to murder in cold blood. Such an image would deepen the horror and anxieties surrounding an illness. One cannot underestimate the power of metaphors, which often penetrate into the visceral and unconscious realms of being in a clandestine and uncanny manner. Metaphorization is a mode of imaginative mapping. For someone who mistakes the metaphorical interpretation for the event, the map is the territory. In the case of the metaphorical use, the map or description, label, or inference may not be even structurally or semantically similar to the territory of the event in a Koshipskian sense. Metaphors are endowed with limitless and multi-layered semantic possibilities as well as cultural nuances. They may also open a Pandora's box of undesirable allusions and undertones. Moreover, metaphors give body to ideas, prejudices, and emotions associated with illness as a psycho-physio-sociological state. Metaphors in illness narratives and life writing exude the paradox of too much proximity and too much distance. Metaphorical thinking may lead to more acute involvement with illness than a verbal engagement would permit. Sometimes, authors of autobiographical accounts have observed that metaphors help maintain a distance from illness which literalness cannot handle. Metaphors may act as tools for impersonating oneself and approaching the illness impersonally. Metaphors and other figures of speech that narrate the story of an ailing, wounded self may intervene in the self's thinking processes. Metaphors with their cultural implications and personal references lead to intense experiences that may usher one into a vortex of mixed sensations and neurosemantic responses. The cultural baggage that corporeal metaphors bear are heavy with fear, shame, stigma, religious and mythological views on human body, perspectives on being and mortality, moral and ethical notions and prejudices, popular and medical preconceptions, and the like. Illness is an indeterminable territory in constant flux. Our scientific understanding of an illness keeps changing as there takes place more research on human body, pathology, and other fields related to ailments. The experiential cultural territory of any illness cannot be plotted uniformly, as the same illness may manifest and be interpreted in different cultures and individuals with marked variations. The maps would range from a medical label or common name like HIV/AIDS, a category, STD, contagious, a misinformation, the gay disease, a metaphor, vengeful angel, or symptoms, loss of weight, falling ill frequently, fatigue, etc. The principles of non-identity and non-allness come to help in making sense of the relationship between the territory of illness and its many maps, including the metaphorical ones. Considering a metaphorical statement and what it metaphorizes as semantic or conceptual equivalence is an error we make frequently and inadvertently. Assuming that there exists a one-to-one semantic or structural correspondence between the already complex and obscure territory of illness and the maps constructed through metaphorization can lead to a grievous misevaluation. Misevaluation arises from confusing and manipulative use of language and concepts. On several occasions, misevaluation may be the product of ignorance, vested interest, or lack of sensitivity. Such misevaluating affects the thoughts and attitudes of not one person or a generation, but many generations to come. Lakoff and Johnson emphasize how metaphors can act as self-fulfilling prophecies. I quote, "Metaphors may create realities for us, especially social realities. A metaphor may thus be a guide for future action. In this sense, metaphors can be self-fulfilling prophecies," end quote. A way to handle metaphors is to understand them in terms of non-identity and non-allness. A metaphorical representation illustrates the gap between the event and the object levels. In such a scenario, such quotients as dwelling longer at the silent level and being mindful enough to facilitate thalamocortical integration become important. A metaphor constructs and generates an array of associative meanings and subjectivities. It is through imaginative connections and force of language that metaphors create alternative modes of thinking and realities. Altered perspective created by metaphorization alters the viewer and the viewed. The metaphorization of language seldom escapes the metaphorization of reality. Illness metaphors have been internalized so much that they are part of our unconscious thinking. We come across, use, and generate them all the time without being overtly conscious of metaphorization. Consider statements like emotional hygiene is vital for mental fitness. Nurturing healthy companionship between the sexes is the best prevention and remedy for the rape culture, which have incorporated multiple aspects of illness metaphorically to explain and enhance certain views about apparently unrelated phenomena. It may be of great advantage to medical professionals, media personnel, caregivers, and patients to understand sensitively what illness metaphors are capable of meaning and doing. Metaphors may exaggerate and mystify the experience of illness and bring in reference and allusions that invoke terror, disgust, guilt, and hatred for oneself. Susan Sontag's warning about metaphors of illness and illness as metaphor should not be taken lightly. Mapping through metaphorization may blow out of proportion, distort, and make fiercer the territory of illness. Stigmatizing and punitive metaphors of illness may generate such shame and fear that patients feel reluctant to even seek medical help. Directly or figuratively describing the ill as a cursed or God-forsaken being, looking at illness as a form of punishment or karma, and interpreting pain as a way of redeeming the self from its sins are some examples. Metaphors do facilitate cross-domain mapping. The word in common parlance, cancer, meaning crab, for denoting an illness popularly perceived to be tenacious, painful, and fearsome, is an example of metaphorical thinking involving conceptual cross-domain mapping that carries associations based on general principles. Cancer became the common name for an illness that in many ways appears and acts like a crab. Cancer narratives would illustrate how cancer generates a plethora of such fierce metaphors as cannibal, marauder, killer, doppelganger, diabolic pregnancy, and Sexton uses this metaphor about her mother's uterine cancer, insect, gargoyle, canker feeding on the flower and fruit of life, beast, murderer, and the like, suggesting the invasive, insidious, and destructive spree of the disease. Cancer is an ailment which the medical science could not fully comprehend in terms of its diagnosis, treatment, and cure. The mysteriousness of the illness could be the reason why cancer has become a breeding ground for metaphors. The word hysteria metaphorically connects and stigmatizes hyster or the womb as the seat of emotional excesses and madness. Misconceptions lead to misdirected actions, evident from the fact that hysterectomy was part of the treatment for female insanity long ago. One should realize that the maps created by metaphorization are larger in scale and thicker with detail and subtext than the territories of tangible phenomena. Mistaking the maps for the territory in this context would be a serious error in judgment. Practicing conscious abstracting and extensional thinking may save one from the quagmire of emotional or ideational excesses implicated in identification with and misevaluation of metaphors. Thorough knowledge of the multi-ordinality of words and concepts informed by history and culture is important in any linguistic, communicative, or aesthetic scenario. Positive and negative values are invariably assigned to metaphors of illness. Health is metaphorized through positive images, suggesting prosperity, light, vitality, and hope, and illness metaphors wear the garbs of darkness, hopelessness, fear, and destitution. Metaphors of elevation, exuberance, and vibrancy are associated with health, whereas being low, dullness, paleness, and colorlessness are associated with illness. The war metaphors identifying the illness with an enemy, the patient with a warrior, cure with victory, and death with failure or surrender usually have a subtle accusatory potential. Have we not come across expressions such as, after a prolonged battle with illness, Mr. X surrendered? Death finally defeated him in his war with AIDS. And if this treatment strategy fails, we have to devise a new line of attack against the deadly virus. Such metaphorical statements attribute a problematic agential role to the patient or the doctor, as if their will and actions are the determining factors of the victory and failure in the war against illness. Metaphorical thinking seeks analogical correspondence between an ailing self and dark images, such as a haunted house, a dilapidated edifice, a cracked vase, a vehicle that is broken down, a wounded bird, or an injured animal, a damaged toy, a dismantled doll, a non-functioning machine, and the like. Individuals going through experiences of disabling or disfiguring illness and imminent death may relate to such images quite viscerally, at a deeper level of self-identification. I am in no way suggesting that writers should not use any dark images about illness in their texts. Readers should be able to resist the tendency of excessive and self-destructive identification and empathy with the metaphor. To deal with pejorative metaphors surrounding body and illness, one may develop awareness that would challenge negativity and preconceptions surrounding illness. Information on body and ailments purged of inaccurate and biased views helps one in handling figurative language about illness more sensibly and sensitively. An absolute rupture between language, knowledge, aesthetics, and existence is impossible. It is important to understand the metaphorical dimensions of thought, reason, and imagination which impact our actions. Thank you.